Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host, Simon Wams here. One of my writers, in this case Danny, thank you Danny, has written me The Sign of the Suffolk Strangler. Never heard of the Suffolk Strangler. And so that's the format of the show. Never read it before. Let's jump in. During the early evening of a particularly spine-chilling night in December 2006, the regional UK news programme ITV Anglia transmitted another report on one of the biggest stories to have ever engulfed the east of England. The body of a murdered sex worker had already been discovered in Belstead Brook near Ipswich, and the body of another sex worker would be found in the very same brook just a few days later. The man who would later become known as the Suffolk Strangler was still very much on the prowl, and more sex workers would go missing in the weeks to come. Sometimes I'm like, have I never heard of this? This is well within my lifetime. Not lifetime. I was 19 in 2006. But it's kind of one of those things where you're like, did I forget about this? There was some serial killer operating and drowning sex workers in rivers. There was now growing concern over the safety of the women who continued to ignore warnings to stay well clear of the red light district in Ipswich, where the victims were known to have picked up regular trade. To illustrate their point, a reporter from ITV Anglia conducted a brief interview just outside of the red light district with a woman who was only identified on screen as Kelly, but whose real name was Paula Clennell. Well, yes, I do understand. Look, if someone is working as a sex worker and not I think this should be legalized, to be honest. But they're probably not someone who's got a ton of disposable income where they can just not show up for work. And they need the money. So of course they're going to keep showing up even though there's a risk. That's how it works. Although this was never revealed at the time, Paula was caught in the grip of a drug addiction, which was costing her about £500 a day. Good Lord Almighty. And this was the sole reason she was risking the dangers of working the streets. I just didn't know drug addictions could run so deep. That's £500 in 2006, let's say £600 today. That's an extraordinary amount of money. That's 18 grand a month. Paula revealed that she'd suffered a few nasty experiences in the past and that she had felt physically sick when she'd heard the news of the first murder. She now felt wary about getting into a car with a stranger, but she still intended to carry on. She told the reporter, "If you need the money badly, it's better than going out thieving. I need the money." Immediately after the interview, Paula was filmed defiantly making her way back into the red light district. It wouldn't be the last time that Paula Clennell would feature on the news, but the next time would be under very different circumstances. Between the 30th of October and the 10th of December 2006, the Suffolk Strangler would brutally murder a total of 5 sex workers in the local area, taking the time to pose at least some of the bodies in a macabre cruciform position before they were inevitably discovered. But what were his motives, and was the right man convicted of the crimes? Oh, interesting. So someone's behind bars for this. Okay. The fact that he was called the Suffolk Strangler and stuff made me think, he's just going to be he somehow got away with it. And could it be possible that the Suffolk Strangler is responsible for a far longer list of earlier murders and disappearances, which are still officially unsolved today? Ipswich is the county town of Suffolk, and one of the oldest towns in England, with roots stretching back to Roman times. You'd think that a town with such an enduring history would be bursting with fascinating facts and notable residents, but with apologies to any Ipswichians who may be watching this video, it's bloody hard to come up with anything particularly interesting about Ipswich. I don't think I've ever been to Ipswich. It's about 70 miles northeast of London, if that's any help. It's not even that far away from where I grew up, and I've never been there. I've heard of it, but I've never thought about it for very long at all. It used to be big on pottery back in the Roman days and was a bustling hub for the wool trade back in the medieval era. The town apparently had one of the best football clubs in England during the 1970s and early 80s, but those glory days are now just a distant memory. And the most notable resident from history to share a connection with Ipswich in the 80s is synth pop genius and the most underrated musician of all time, Nick Kershaw. Although even he was actually born in Bristol. I have no idea who Nick Kershaw is. Is this just one of Daddy's favourite bands or favourite musicians? He's just slipping it in there, being like, this guy should be super famous. Maybe should be. Maybe I'll check him out on Spotify. Maybe you will too. Even Rotherham boasts more famous faces than that, and not all of them criminals. Yeah, Danny's from Rotherham, so he's allowed to make fun of Rotherham, and the North in general. But in 2006, the town of Ipswich was to make the national headlines for all the wrong reasons in the run-up to Christmas during a brief period of terror, which evoked dark memories of Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper, who was convicted of the murders of 13 women over a period of 5 years during the 1970s. Nearly all of them were sex workers workers, and we have done a video on Peter Sutcliffe if you feel like diving into that misery. Of course, the risks of being a sex worker had always loomed large in the interim, another reason why it should be legalized and regulated. In the decade prior to these 2006 murders, a very conservative estimate of 89 sex workers have been killed in the UK, many of them at the hands of their clients. And a further deeply troubling statistic is that a murderer is far more likely to get away with killing a sex worker, as the causes are far more complex to investigate and the bodies are often never found. Whereas just under 90% of homicides in the UK ultimately result in conviction, this figure falls sharply when specifically addressing the murders of sex workers. A third of all such cases remain unsolved. I'd speculate, the obvious conclusion to jump to, as we've seen many times on The Casual Criminalist, is it's just like, well, the police just give less of a shit. And we've seen this in the past. I don't know if it's still true today. I hope it's not, but we've seen it before. But I'd also speculate that 90% conviction, or conviction? Yes, 90% conviction is probably, because they know the person they're murdering beyond a transactional relationship like sex work. It's people murdering with a motive, rather than just being a psycho. And people killing sex workers are psychos, and it's harder to track them because the motive is weird. Yet even taking into account this disturbing recent history, and even with the memories of Peter Sutcliffe's monstrous killing spree still fresh in the mind, nobody was prepared for the 6 weeks of horror perpetrated by the Suffolk Strangler, which was centered around the red light district of Ipswich, just around the corner from the town's football grounds. The first body to be discovered was that of Gemma Adams. She was first reported missing on November the 15th after her boyfriend of over 10 years informed the police that the 25-year-old had stopped responding to text messages. Gemma had grown up in a quite comfortable middle-class household in the village of Kesgrave near Ipswich. The former brownie had learned to ride horses and play the piano and harboured dreams of joining the police force. Brownies are like I don't know if you have this in America, so maybe if you... Oh no, you have Girl Scouts, because I've heard of Girl Scout cookies. Brownies are what we call Girl Scouts, right? Or are they like, my sister was a brownie, are they like they're younger girls before they become Girl Scouts or something like this? I was never into this stuff. I never joined the Scouts or any of that jazz. Described by her parents as bright, bubbly and intelligent, life seemed to take a downhill turn for Gemma at the age of 15 when she met her boyfriend John Simpson and they began both dabbling in cannabis. Yeah, a gateway drug to £500 a day drug addiction. This wasn't her, this was someone else, but still, it's just cannabis, chill. She left home to move in with Simpson at the age of 16, and within the space of a year, the couple had taken an alarming leap from recreational cannabis experimentation to full-blown heroin addiction. Oh my god, I make fun of the gateway drug thing, because that's largely proved to be nonsense, right? Because it's I don't know, how many people do you know who smoke weed, or have done weed, any sort of half-regular basis? I've smoked weed many times. Number of times I've done heroin? Zero. How many people do I know who would smoke weed who then do heroin? Maybe they'd try ecstasy or do a little LSD. Maybe like that. But heroin? Like properly hardcore life-ruining drugs? None. Don't know a single person. With encouragement from her naturally worried parents, Gemma sought help from a community drug rehabilitation team, and she later landed a job working for an insurance company. But neither Gemma nor her boyfriend had fully managed to conquer their demons, and in 2004, she was sacked after taking frequent sick days and completely disappearing during lunch breaks. With the backing of her boyfriend, Gemma turned to sex work to fund their heroin addictions, initially working at massage parlours before taking to the streets. She was last seen alive in the red light district of Ipswich during the very early hours of November the 15th, outside a BMW dealership. I'd kind of think that BMW dealership would be in a nicer part of town than the red light district. It's not exactly a brilliant image, is it, for BMW? Her naked body was eventually discovered by a member of the public on December the 2nd in the waters of Belstead Brook near the village of Hintlesham in Suffolk, around 7 miles from Ipswich. It's believed that Gemma's body had probably travelled quite some distance downstream after it had first been dumped during a period of torrential weather when the brook was flooded and only became potentially visible to passers-by when the water levels had fallen back down again. The police confirmed that Gemma had not been sexually assaulted, but an exact cause of death was never determined. An autopsy concluded that she had been asphyxiated, but it was impossible to rule out drowning as the final cause. Whilst Gemma's parents had known about her troubles with drug addiction and had tried to help her in every way they possibly could, they had no idea that their daughter had been funding her addiction on the streets. Although the body of Gemma Adams was the first to be found, she actually wasn't the first sex worker to be reported missing or the first to be murdered by the Suffolk Strangler. The first was the youngest of all the victims, 19-year-old Tanya Nicol, who had last been seen late at night on October the 30th, very close to the Ipswich football grounds. Tanya had grown up in Ipswich with a passion for Harry Potter, Charles Dickens, and UK rock band The Zootons. I don't know The Zootons. Charles Dickens I don't like. I like Harry Potter, enjoyed that. I'm not a fantasy person, so it says something like I really enjoyed Harry Potter. Charles Dickens, though, is so wordy. Maybe I need to revisit Charles Dickens, because I remember reading it a while ago and being like, good lord with the words, my man. But maybe now I've matured a little bit, maybe I'll enjoy Charles Dickens more. Maybe I'll give it a crack. Described by her family as a happy, bubbly, outgoing character, she worked hard at school and signed up with the Sea Cadets, during which period she either enjoyed or endured the experience of meeting the not yet disgraced Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew. However, in a story which tragically mirrors the life of Gemma Adams, everything changed when Tanya hit the age of 15 and hooked up with a new boyfriend. Oh, I've got a daughter, and it's like, no. And it's like, you look at these people's backgrounds, and it's like, they sort of have the background that my child will have, like middle class, comfortably off, just this, I don't like this. And it's like, now I've got a daughter who's now 4 years old, and I'm like, in 10 years, she's going to be a teenager. And this girl was 15 when she's hooking up with her new boyfriends and changing her life, and oh god. And it's like, I look at this, and it's not like, oh, this is some like other background that I didn't have or my kids won't have. It's like, no, this is the sort of backgrounds I had, where you're like middle class and just like super normal. And then it's like, oh god, heroin. And drugs and boyfriends. No, I don't want it. The young couple began experimenting with cannabis before swiftly moving on to heroin, after which Tanya began working in brothels until she was sacked on suspicion of using drugs, a move which forced her to work out on the streets. She was still living at home with her mother and younger brother when she left the house for the final time on the 30th of October. Her mother reported her missing when she failed to return home. And just 6 days after the discovery of the body of Gemma Adams, the naked body of Tanya Nicol was located by police divers on December the 8th, in the very same brook near an area known locally as Copdock Mill, just a couple of miles further downstream. The body again showed signs of asphyxiation, but not sexual assault. And again, a definitive cause of death could not be determined. Whilst it was deemed likely that she was already dead before being placed in the water, her lungs had become hyperinflated, which indicates a possibility that the cause of death was drowning. Gemma Adams and Tanya Nicol had actually known each other very well, as they shared the same patches in the Ipswich red light district. And again, whilst the parents knew full well that their daughter was battling drug addiction, they had no idea that she was funding that addiction on the streets. I mean, you're gonna, like, don't you have suspicions or something? Like, yo, parents, this isn't your fault at all. I'm speaking from a position of complete ignorance. But where are you getting £500 a day that isn't crime? Her father had bluntly warned Tanya that if she didn't quit the drugs, she'd either end up in prison or dead. Meanwhile, her mother had apparently been under the false impression that Tanya had just started a new job at a local hairdresser's. An incredibly well-paying new job. But her father, Jim Nicol, wanted to make something very clear to the press following the death of his daughter. He said, "I wasn't disappointed with her. These are daughters, not just things, not sex machines. They are human beings who went to school, who were bright, pretty, and innocent. And then they grow up in a world of drugs and evil. They fell into corruption." Jesus, man. It's like, I don't know, this hits home much more. Like, a few years ago, before I had kids, I'd just be like, yeah, okay, I kind of get it. But now it's like, now it's different. I don't know what to say. Just 2 days later, a third gruesome discovery was made, and this time it felt as if the killer was attempting to leave behind a disturbing and distinctive new signature for the police to uncover. 24-year-old Annalie Alderton had largely been raised in Ipswich, but she had moved around a fair bit during her childhood, and following the separation of her parents, she spent a 5-year stint with her mother in Cyprus, during which time she became fluent in Greek. A dedicated student who regularly hit excellent grades, Annalie fostered an ambition to become a model. But a huge turning point in Annalie's life occurred when she was 16 years old. Her beloved father, Roy, a computer programmer, died from lung cancer, and Annalie was reported to have never come to terms with a harrowing loss. What does that mean, though, come to terms with a loss? Like, do you really ever? Like, you obviously accept it, but it's not something you ever really get over. It's something that's always with you. Almost immediately after the funeral, she left home and moved into a small flat, during which time she was said to have fallen under the influence of a man described as a sexual predator who introduced Annalie to hard drugs. This led to a downward spiral in which she turned to sex work and ended up getting jailed 3 times for persistent theft. However, her later boyfriend Sam Jefford, insisted that they had reached a point where they were trying to sort their lives out. In 2006, Annalie already had a 5.5-year-old son called Freddie, and the couple had just become aware that Annalie was pregnant again, an event which they were reported to have considered as a powerful incentive to try and get clean and forge a stable new family home. Annalie was still 3 months pregnant when she was reported missing on December the 3rd. Her naked body was found 7 days later in a patch of woodland near a small private school in the village of Nacton in Suffolk, a few miles southeast from Ipswich. But there was a grim new twist to this already grotesque discovery. Her legs had been pushed together, and her arms had been deliberately outstretched to form a crucifix shape, and Annalie wouldn't be the last victim to have been purposefully posed in such a manner. This time, the post-mortem was more conclusive. Annie Alderton had died from asphyxiation. She had more than likely been killed elsewhere and then dragged to this remote spot very shortly afterwards, where the body had been left for days before it was eventually discovered. Unlike the first two cases, the victim's mother strongly suspected, with a heavy heart, that Annalie was working in the red light district. The last time she saw her daughter alive, Annalie was heading off to catch the train to Ipswich. As she walked away, Annalie had cheerfully waved to her mother and shouted, "Goodbye, Mum. I love you." Her mother felt that she knew exactly where Annalie was going and was too upset to even respond to Annalie's final goodbye. By this time, the nation was still processing the news that 3 women who had worked in the same red light district had all been murdered in such a remarkably short window of time, in such a remarkably small area, and in such a remarkably similar manner. If a serial killer wasn't on the loose, this was a hell of a coincidence. If the police don't start from the idea that there's a serial killer, that's an insane thing. This is not a coincidence.
Coincidence? I think not!
During one of several press conferences, the senior investigating officer, DCS Stuart Gull, confirmed that all of the victims were drug users. None of them had suffered self-defense wounds, and no weapon appeared to be involved, suggesting that the victims may have been heavily subdued by drugs directly before the attacks. At this point, it had not been revealed to the public that the body of Annalie Alderton had been posed in a cruciform position. DCS Gull urgently appealed for anyone with information to come forward to the police, and even offered an effective amnesty to drug pushers who may have been able to provide new leads. He stated, "We would like to speak to those who may have supplied drugs. I am not interested in any peripheral offences. We have one aim, to find who is responsible for the deaths of these girls." Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's going to come forward to the police station and be like, "Yo, it was me, I sell drugs." But anonymous tip-offs, I think this is a good way to encourage anonymous tip-offs, where it's like you're kind of encouraged thinking, okay, the police aren't going to follow up on this, but I think it's important because I'm a drug dealer, I'm not a complete piece of shit. The police also expressed their concerns over 2 other sex workers in the local area who had now been reported missing. One of them was 29-year-old Annette Nicholls, while the other was named as 24-year-old Paula Clennell. The last time we mentioned Paula Clennell, she was defiantly walking back into the Ipswich red light district, having just conducted a brief interview with ITV Anglia, in which she admitted that she intended to continue working the streets despite the sickening news of the recent murders in the area. Just 2 days after the discovery of the previous victim in the patch of woodlands, the fates of both Paula Clennell and Annette Nicholls were revealed on December the 12th. Paula had grown up in Northumberland, but had moved around during the later years of a troubled childhood, which involved her spending some time in a referral unit. After her parents separated, she moved to Ipswich with her mother before hooking up with a new boyfriend at the age of 16 and moving into a flat with him. And you can probably guess where this is heading. Paula had already been experimenting with cannabis from the age of 13. That is pretty damn young. But by the time she hit her late teens, both Paula and the boyfriend were addicted to crack, a habit which would ultimately be funded by Paula's stints as a sex worker on the streets of Ipswich. I'm a little bit worried here that we seem to be implying that every young female who ever experiments with cannabis or leaves home and moves in with their boyfriend is destined to become a sex worker addicted to either heroin or crack. Over the years, I've known many people who moved in with their partner at around the age of 16. Really? It's very young. And I've known a lot of more people who have experimented with cannabis, but I don't believe I've ever known anyone who became addicted to heroin or crack. Yeah, that's I think, my experience as well. I do know someone who was addicted to heroin. I met them very briefly. And I was like, well, that's really unpleasant, my dude. I think it's important to remember that we're obviously talking about a string of extreme situations here, which led to tragically extreme outcomes. And I'm afraid to report that a tragically extreme outcome was most definitely awaiting Paula Clennell. Described by her friends as sharp, witty, and streetwise, Paula was still clearly struggling by the age of 24 after her 3 young children were taken from her and placed into care. During the run-up to Christmas, she had written a letter to her mother in which she revealed why she was in no mood to celebrate the imminent festivities. She wrote, "Instead of being a happy day of joy and togetherness, it's only a dark, lonely, and depressing day. Her friends later claimed that Paula had always predicted that she'd be dead before she made it to 25, but she believed that her drug addiction would be the cause. Whilst it's perhaps fair to say that a £500 a day drug addiction was the reason why she headed back off into the red light district after wrapping up the interview with ITV Anglia, it's not the reason why she'd be found dead in the next 72 hours. Her body was spotted by a pedestrian on December the 12th in a patch of wasteland by the old Felixstowe Road near the village of Levington, a couple of miles southeast from Ipswich. It was again concluded that the victim had not been sexually assaulted, but that she had been killed by compression of her throat while she was heavily intoxicated from opiates. Unusually, it looked as if the body had been dumped in a hurry, perhaps indicating that the killer had been disturbed and had fled the scene earlier than intended. But whilst the police were still dealing with the situation and cordoning off the road from the public, yet another gruesome discovery was made just a few minutes later. A police helicopter had been dispatched to monitor the crime scene from above, but the crew picked up more than they were expecting when they spotted another partially hidden body just a few hundred yards away by the same old Felixstowe Road. The fifth and final victim was the other named missing sex worker, 29-year-old Annette Nicholls. The body had been stretched out in a cruciform shape, identical to the pose in which the third victim, Annalie Alderton, had been found just a couple of days earlier. Yet again, there were no signs of sexual assault, and whilst it was impossible to determine the exact cause of death in this case, it was noted that her breathing had been severely hampered. It's likely that Annette's body had been lying near the road for a few days before it was eventually spotted by a police helicopter. Close friends of Annette Nicholls have expressed their astonishment over how the change in her behaviour almost appeared to happen overnight at a relatively late stage in her life in comparison to the other younger victims. The single mother was known as Nettie to her friends and had recently become a qualified beautician after completing a 4-year course at Suffolk College. She was considered to be a risk-averse personality who maintained an absolutely immaculate house while studying hard and bringing up her 4-year-old son single-handedly. But everything seemed to change when she was encouraged by the council to move into a bigger housing estate in Ipswich. It's been suggested that she hooked up with a new boyfriend at the time, who introduced her to heroin. But whilst we're not certain of the exact details, the lifestyle slide was certainly dramatic. I mean, if there's something that's going to do that to you, it's going to be like drugs like heroin. It's going to take your nice life and turn it upside down. Shortly after asking her mum to help out more with looking after her young son, Nettie had turned to sex work to finance her sudden heroin addiction, and the new house was later repossessed. She had been reported missing in early December after her family became worried over the news of the recent murders of women in the area, although at this stage they had no idea that their daughter was into drugs or was risking her life on the streets of Ipswich in order to get a hold of them. Just like most of the other victims, Nettie had managed to keep the darker elements of her new life a complete secret from those who loved her the most. And of course, the belated exposure of such secrets only made the harrowing situation even tougher for the families of the victims, who were not only dealing with the loss of their daughters, but were also being confronted for the first time with the harsh realities of their final days. This also proved to be a challenge for the police, who were not only dealing with a sudden high volume of bereaved family members, but were also battling against disbelief and denial over the gut-wrenching secrets that had remained hidden when the victims were still alive. The police were also simultaneously attempting to avert any further murders by making desperate public appeals for all sex workers in the Ipswich area to avoid the red light district and stay indoors. Jackie Cheer, the Assistant Chief Constable of Suffolk, appeared on television to issue the following plea to local workers. Your welfare is my priority. My message to you is simple. Stay off the streets. If you are out alone at night, you're putting yourself in danger. It sounds like a pretty sensible idea under the circumstances, but such a desperate public plea was sadly likely to go unheeded by such a desperate segment of the community, a point noted by various sex worker support groups shortly afterwards. Yeah, exactly what I said at the start. It's like, yo, they need money. They're not, you know? Come on. Nikki Adams was a spokesperson for the English Collective of Prostitutes, which I have to admit is not an organisation I ever knew existed. She pointed out, the women are very scared, but they do not have an option to leave prostitution. Most are incensed by the police approach to stay home, or that they have brought it upon themselves, saying that they've made themselves vulnerable because of their work. I mean, yes, they've made themselves vulnerable because of their work. Of course they have. That's true. But to say they brought it upon themselves is like this classic police thing of just caring about this less. And that's kind of crazy. A sex worker who gave the name of Susie backed up this point when she told reporters, with Christmas coming, we don't have the choice to stay off the streets. The police make it sound like it's our fault if we get attacked. She also suggested that most sex workers feel as if they can't turn to the police in the event of an attack from a client. 2 women I know recently reported attacks. One was hurt badly, but the police did nothing. They told her there was no chance it would come to court. That attitude gets around, so other women don't come forward. This does highlight some of the specific problems with victims of brutal crime who happen to be sex workers. Whilst I'm sure that Assistant Chief Constable Jackie Cheer's heart was in the right place during a plea for potential victims to stay off the streets for their own safety, it betrayed a lack of understanding as to why this was an impossibly useless request to direct at anyone caught in the grip of drug addiction. The wording of the statement may also have seemed to support the perception that the police felt sex workers only had themselves to blame if they ignored such mildly patronizing advice from people who knew best. This line of thinking wasn't just limited to the police force. Whilst I would like to think that the overwhelming majority of the nation were deeply affected and concerned by the murders of 5 innocent young women within the space of a few weeks, there were also those who seemed to think that the deaths of sex workers are not to be taken quite as seriously as other deaths. After all, they chose to become addicted to drugs, they chose to put themselves in danger, and by the same shaky logic, they presumably chose to get strangled to death by a serial killer. Yes, which is obviously nonsense. They brought it all upon themselves, and the police should be devoting their time instead to solving, proper murders. It's clearly a misguided and ignorant attitude, which we'll return to later, and we've also covered so many times on this podcast in the past. Like the number of times, she was a sex worker, so we don't have to look into it that thoroughly. She's not a person, she's a sex machine. Come on now, police, do better. Which we'll return to later in the hopes that we may have at least seen some signs of encouraging shifts in opinion and policing and law since 2006. On a more unexpectedly comical note, let's see. Many devoted husbands were said to have received an ear-bashing from their wives if they ever dared to express concern over the thought of their wife travelling alone at night during this perturbing period. The implication often taken from this was that the husband was accusing the wife of being a sex worker on the side. Really? I'd just be like, there's a murderer out. And yes, they've only targeted sex workers, but if you're walking through that part of town, be careful. To be fair, though, Assistant Chief Constable Jackie Cheer had already extended her advice to cover all women in the local area with an eye on the imminent Christmas celebrations. She had this message for all women of Suffolk. We're coming up to the party season and up to Christmas. By all means, enjoy yourselves, but plan your nights out. Go out together, stick together, and do not leave your friends alone. The sex workers that were being exclusively targeted by the Suffolk Strangler may not have paid a blind bit of notice to the warnings, which is obviously a pity as they were the only ones being attacked, but everybody else did as the region fell under a pre-Christmas shockwave of fear. Many women cancelled their plans and stayed indoors. Others completely changed their routines and only ventured out in big groups, while thousands of personal attack alarms were flying off the shelves of the local shops, hopefully not as last-minute stocking fillers. The manager of a call centre in Ipswich offered up £50,000 as a reward for any information leading to a conviction, telling the press that he wanted the killer off the streets as he employed hundreds of women in his call centre, although I think it's important to remember that he probably wasn't suggesting that they were all sex workers. No, definitely not. Also, manager of a call centre giving away 50 grand? Doing a hell of a good job managing that call centre. Of course, everyone wanted the Suffolk Strangler off the streets before he struck again, and the police were working around the clock to prevent the prospect of a 6th or 7th victim getting discovered within the next few days. But there were several puzzling elements to the case, though, which didn't entirely fit together when stitching together the clues. On the face of it, it seemed highly likely that the police were hunting a single serial killer, as each murder bore so many similarities. Yeah, I mean, that's the initial conclusion to go to, right? That seems very sensible. There's, of course, the idea of copycat killers, or it being a coincidence. I'd say serial killer most likely, copycat slightly below that, and then it just being a coincidence is pretty wildly unlikely. Statistically. Each victim had been strangled, even if it hadn't always been possible to pinpoint this as the cause of death, and there was no evidence of use of a weapon in any of the murders. Every victim had been left naked, apart from occasional bits of jewelry, and none of them had been sexually assaulted directly before the murder. Every victim had been left in a spot that was slightly hidden away from plain sight to avoid an immediate discovery, but in a reasonably accessible spot, ensuring that the bodies would inevitably be found sooner rather than later, perhaps indicating that the killer was equipped with in-depth local knowledge. And of course, every victim was a sex worker who had picked up business at the Ipswich red light district and was consequently murdered within the space of 6 weeks and discarded within just a few miles of each other. But there were a couple of differences too. The first 2 victims had been placed in the overflowing waters of a flooded brook, perhaps indicating that the killer was attempting to wash away any potential forensic evidence and that he kind of knew what he was doing. Yet the other 3 bodies, found later, had been dumped in patches of countryside and shrubland, which positively invited comprehensive forensic examinations. Also, maybe they're just not thinking about it that much, or they're just growing bolder in their killing. Like, as something, the escalation is a thing? Was the same man going out of his way to avoid detection whilst deliberately providing as many clues as possible? And then there was the fact that 2 of the victims had been laid out in a cruciform pose, almost as some kind of mocking calling card, yet the other 3 hadn't been arranged in such a way. Again, it could just be an escalation, because it was the 2 final ones with the cruciforms, right? The final 2 bodies, maybe not, sorry, maybe I just got my murder victims mixed up. The final 2 bodies were likely to have been discarded at broadly the same time, and were found within a few hundred yards of each other, but only one of them had been carefully posed in a crucifix shape, while the other looked as if it had been carelessly dumped in a hurry. Why were there such major differences in method? Could be copycat. Could be there's a second person who's out there murdering because they think they're going to get pinned on the first person. I mean, I don't suppose it's written in stone that a murderer should behave in entirely predictable patterns in the interests of a fair investigation. In fact, it's been suggested that he may have been deliberately trying to wrong-foot the police into thinking that multiple killers with very different styles were at work, although, if that were the case, I would have thought that he may have considered mixing up some of the various other elements that appeared to be pretty much identical. I suspect it's more likely that the killer only came up with the idea of the cruciform signature after he'd already murdered his first 2 victims. This pose obviously couldn't be maintained after placing the bodies in fast-moving water, so he made a decision instead to leave all of his future cruciform victims out in the open. The fact that one of the final victims appeared to have been dumped in a hurry without being posed just suggests that his plan fell apart on that occasion, and he had to leave the scene quickly to avoid being caught in the act. I'd say that's a very sensible conclusion. I think that, combined with possible escalation in the crimes and the audacity, I still think it's one dude. One thing the police were sure of during the early stages of the investigation was that the locations of the bodies were not the murder scenes. During a couple of later press conferences held on the 13th and 14th of December, Senior Investigating Officer DCS Stuart Gull declared that these locations were more likely to be deposition sites, to which the bodies were dragged possibly quite some distance after the murders had taken place elsewhere, potentially at a single site. DCS Gull also revealed that the police had recovered a number of items in nearby locations, including a fluorescent jacket, a handbag, and various women's accessories, which were now being put through vigorous forensic tests to try and establish potential links with any of the 5 victims. At around the same time, the father of victim Paula Clennell was making his own distinctive appeal for witnesses to come forward with information that may help crack the case. Brian Clennell felt that the regular clients of the local sex workers might have observed more than they were currently letting on. He told the press to, quote, "The fat, smelly perverts. They should come forward and stop this murder that's going on." The quote ends. I'm not sure many of the regular clients were going to feel particularly encouraged to spring into action in response to that call. No, I get where he's coming from, but it's not the right way to go about getting what you want. However, the police clearly felt that they had to do a bit more than just make an urgent appeal for all fat, smelly perverts to report to their nearest police station at once. Under the code name of Operation Sumac, the Suffolk Constabulary launched an investigation that was so huge in scale, police officers had to be drafted in from all over the country to help out with the case. At one point, over 650 officers were working on the investigation. 5 separate incident rooms had to be set up at Suffolk Police HQ, and over 3,000 calls a day were being received from the public. 176 different sites around Ipswich were searched, and hundreds of pedestrians and motorists were questioned, along with 400 local men on the sex offenders register. 1,500 door-to-door inquiries were made, and over 11,000 hours of CCTV footage were deeply scrutinised for clues. If anyone was still wondering just how seriously the Suffolk Constabulary would take the murders of 5 sex workers, the answer appeared to be more seriously than any other investigation in their history. Well, good. I mean, this is exactly the turn that I like to see in these Casual Criminalist episodes. It's a little bit slow, but at least it happened, and when it happened, they fully turned that hose on, didn't they? Hang on a minute, though. The police might have just been wasting their time and resources with all this investigation malarkey. How? Some guy had just wandered into the police station to declare himself as the prime suspect. Well, that's all right then. Really? Okay. Then my feeling would be he wants to get caught. Like the escalation of the bodies from the river to the dumping in the grassland or whatever is like he's leaving evidence behind on purpose so he gets caught, especially if he's wandering into a police station and just admitting it. 37-year-old Tom Stevens worked at a local branch of Tesco in the village of Martlesham, around 6 miles from Ipswich, although he was reportedly suspended from his trolley collecting duties after he handed himself into the police with the peculiar admission that he may have committed the murders without knowing. What? The former special constable was now a self-confessed sad loner who regularly frequented the red light district of Ipswich after his marriage had broken up 3 years earlier. Wait, so he's a special constable? I don't even know what that is. He told the police that he'd paid for sex with all 5 of the victims, but more than that, he knew most of them very well and often served as their unofficial taxi driver when they needed to pick up drugs. Stevens revealed that he was particularly close to Tanya Nicol and Annette Nicholls, describing himself as the closest thing to a boyfriend that either of them had at the time. When Tanya Nicol had first gone missing, Stevens had even phoned her mother several times to urge her to call the police, as he feared for her safety. Now, Tom Stevens wasn't claiming to have carried out the murders, but he felt obliged to hand himself in, as he thought he must be the prime candidate. He had paid for sex with all the women, he worked unusual hours, had no alibis, he was a bit strange, and he had every opportunity. Oh, wow, I see. He's like, oh my god, they're definitely going to think it's me. I look guilty as sin. I got to get ahead of this thing and be like, dude, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. Or rather more worryingly, he also feared that he might have some kind of split personality, which caused him to carry out terrible acts that he didn't even remember the next day when he reverted back to his normal personality. It sounds a bit to me like he might have thought he was a werewolf. Tom Stevens was never officially named by the police, who only revealed that they'd arrested a 37-year-old man on suspicion of the murder of the 5 women, and that he had been detained for 96 hours following a 36-hour extension granted by magistrates to allow the maximum period of detainment under law. It was Stevens who went blabbing to the BBC and the national press about how he'd been arrested and questioned whilst his house had been searched by the police. He was even happy to tell the police, if it had been me, I would have strangled them. It does seem weird that an innocent man would take time to ponder how exactly he would have carried out the murders that he hoped he hadn't done. And if he hadn't been quite so keen to out himself to the press, he probably wouldn't have lost his job at Tesco. But the police couldn't find any evidence to link Tom Stevens with the murders, and he was ultimately released without charge and let back out into the world on the wild assumption that he probably wasn't a werewolf. Stevens himself had told the press, "It often happens that one man will be arrested and the next one charged." Okay. Stevens, you're a weird man, you know? You're a weird dude. And it turns out he was bang on the money with that one. As Stevens was still being interrogated by the police, a second suspect had already been arrested. This one hadn't come banging on the doors of the police station, though, demanding to be let in. And this one wasn't going to get released after 96 hours. Pouring through those 11,000 hours of CCTV footage had yielded a result of sorts. Tanya Nicol had been spotted climbing into a Ford Mondeo shortly before she went missing. This wasn't Ford Mondeos, like, this is a car. Do they still make Ford Mondeos? But it's the most 2006 car you could possibly imagine. Ford Mondeos in the UK were everywhere. And along with Ford Focuses, Ford Fiestas. I feel like Fords were a mega popular car in the UK for a while. This wasn't exactly a game-changing discovery in itself, as the CCTV footage had presumably shown several of the victims getting into different cars in the hours and days before they were reported missing. But there was something else going on with this Ford Mondeo. A very similar vehicle had also been captured on CCTV in close proximity to the different locations at which the bodies had been dumped at around the same time they were thought to have been moved there. The car belonged to a man by the name of Steve Wright. Steve Wright, you're looking more guilty than... what was the other dude's name? The Tesco dude? Stevens. A local former barman who had only very recently moved slap bang into the middle of the Ipswich red light district with his current partner. The police already had samples of Wright's DNA on file following a minor criminal charge from 3 years earlier. From this, it was possible to quickly prove that the fluorescent jacket, which the police had found nearby one of the deposition sites, belonged to him, and also contained DNA matches to 3 of the victims. Oh, Steve, you're going to prison, mate. I mean, that is... if I was on the jury, the defense has some work to do to persuade me otherwise. Not only that, but Steve Wright's DNA was then later identified on the bodies of the last 3 victims. Presumably, this hadn't been possible with the first 2 victims who'd been placed in a brook, which may have washed away any incriminating evidence. It's possible that his DNA got there because he was clients of theirs, though, isn't it? Having said that, the police were still apparently able to match fibers found in the first victim, Tanya Nicol's hair, with fibers from the carpet of Steve Wright's car. Oh, Steve, no, that is not something that happens normally. Whilst other microscopic fibers from his clothing, car, and house were detected on all 5 bodies. Tiny specks of blood matched with 2 of the victims had also been found in his Ford Mondeo and on his fluorescent jacket. Everything was pointing to the local barman. Yeah, everything's pointing to that local barman, and there's a hell of a lot of everything. As all this evidence was still being collected and analysed, Wright was placed under 24-hour surveillance before the police felt ready to swoop in for the arrest on December the 19th, pausing only to kick former Tesco worker Tom Stevens out of the bloody door. Whenever you hear the name Steve Wright in the UK, it's usually associated with a massively popular and massively overpaid radio broadcaster whose mildly wacky style has been entertaining millions of BBC radio listeners since 1980, and who is still very much on the air today, even though he's at least 20 years past his prime. I have no idea who this Steve Wright is. I'm so out of touch with British stuff like this. But we're not talking about that Steve Wright. No, obviously not. No one thought this, Daddy. We're talking about a Steve Wright who was born in the village of Erpingham in Norfolk in 1958, one of 4 children born to veterinarian nurse Patricia and military policeman Conrad. The very first years of Wright's life were said to be happy and financially comfortable, and the nature of his father's job meant that they hopped around the world quite a bit, spending short stretches in Malta and Singapore. But everything changed when Wright was 6 years old, and his parents went through a turbulent period which led to a separation. When a young Wright waved goodbye to his mother at the train station, he was under the impression that he'd be seeing her again soon. Even his dad believed that it would just be a very temporary separation. In fact, Patricia Wright already knew that she was leaving for good with no intention of returning. Whoa! Oh my God. This is normally the other way around. It's like the dad exits the picture and Patricia's just like, ciao! Decades later, from her new home in California, she alleged the news of the world that the relationship with her husband had grown violent and that she had desperately wanted to take the children with her. Well, go to the courts. They'll side with you. The young Wright reportedly saw his mother's departure as a betrayal, and he became unhappy in his later childhood years. I mean, yeah, fair enough. Whilst Father Conrad married again and had more children, Wright didn't get on with his new stepmother. After leaving school in 1974, Wright landed a job as a chef with the Merchant Navy and went on to work as a steward on the QE2. During this long period on the seas, he married Angela O'Donovan in 1978, with whom he had a son, but the relationship proved to be short-lived. Angela later told the Hartlepool Gazette, "I don't want to say too much, but our marriage wasn't great. It wasn't good, and I was glad when it ended." It's believed that Wright had already been seriously addicted to massage parlours and brothels during this first marriage, and some UK television viewers may even have glimpsed a very brief insight into his life on their TV screens in 1983. During an episode of the long-running travel documentary series Wicker's World, the legendary broadcaster Alan Wicker took a jolly trip to the red light district of Pattaya City in Thailand, where he filmed groups of sailors making the most of their shore leave. Wicker's narration cheerfully described the red light district as the part of town where every sailor dreams of coming to rest and relax. And to help convey the point, his camera settles on none other than Steve Wright, with his arms around a woman who I suspect wasn't his long-term girlfriend. What are the odds? Towards the very end of this time, serving on the QE2, Wright met Diane Cole, who worked as a window dresser for one of the ocean liner's shops, who would become Wright's second wife in 1987. The newlywed couple decided to leave the QE2 behind and settled down in Norwich, where they took the reins of a pub called the Ferryboat Inn, a pleasant little pub with a history stretching back to 1822, which had more recently become known as a popular music venue for dodgy cover bands who performed in a converted boat shed round the back of the pub. Okay. Coincidentally, it was also situated right in the middle of Norwich's red light district. Another coincidence is all pointing to the barman. The tenancy of the pub lasted just 5 months, whilst their second marriage lasted just a year. Diane Cole later alleged to the Mirror that Wright was violent, abusive, and a controlling monster who once attacked her with a knife after falsely accusing her of being with another man, and who once banged her head against a wall after she'd folded the bed sheets the wrong way. Good lord. At the same time, he was alleged to have been withdrawing all the money from their joint bank account to spend on the services of sex workers, whilst ordering Diane to stay behind and keep the pub running. Less than a year later, Wright was back behind the bar of another pub in another relationship. This time, he'd moved to South London, where he became the landlord of the White Horse pub in Chislehurst. It was here that he met barmaid Sarah Whiteley, with whom he had a daughter, but the couple had split up before their daughter's first birthday. Wright then swiftly lost his position as landlord after turning to heavy drinking and gambling, and by the mid-1990s he'd pretty much hit rock bottom after his gambling debts spiraled out of control. He first tried to take his own life in 1994 by carbon monoxide poisoning in his own car, and would make another failed attempt in 2000 after returning home from a 10-week trip to Thailand and taking an overdose of pills. After being declared bankrupt, he made a very brief return to the pub scene as a barman in 2001 when he moved to the town of Felixstowe in Suffolk, but this time it only led to a criminal conviction and 100 hours of community service. He was sacked from the Brook Hotel after he was found guilty of stealing £80 from the till. It may have been a minor conviction for stealing a piffling amount of money, but future consequences of this small threat were pretty immense, as it led to the police taking the DNA sample from Wright, which would help speed up their identification of him as a suspect in the 2006 Ipswich murders. Excellent. It is cool, like how the police, they'll just like, yeah, you know, you're getting booked for like this minor thing, and they'll take your DNA. And it's like, oh boy, you're in that database now. You better not commit any big crimes because we'll come for you. And they came for him. Life did seem to calm down a bit for Wright after he'd served his community service. He met another new partner, Pamela Wright, and they moved into a new house together in Ipswich in the red light district. It's often wrongly reported and assumed that Pamela was Wright's third wife, but in fact they never got married. They just coincidentally shared the same surname. Yeah, Wright's not an uncommon name, so it's a fairly common name in the UK. Not quite as popular as Smith or something, but it's right up there. Get it? Right up there? All seemed to be going fine for a little while at least. Wright picked up a job as a forklift truck driver, Pamela worked night shifts, and the relationship seemed pretty stable. Pamela had no complaints about Wright's character or behaviour, and her biggest mock grumble was that she appeared to be a bit of a golf widow after Wright had joined Seckford Golf Club, where he apparently spent much of his free time and even picked up a few trophies. It's actually quite difficult to source that many first-hand accounts of Steve Wright's character and behaviour from any point in his life. On the face of it, he never seems to have had many friends. But when he got married to his second wife, Tanya Nicol, in 1987, the couple had invited a total of 50 guests to the service, but 46 of those were friends and family of Diane, whilst just 4 were invited by Wright. He was widely described as a very quiet and perhaps even socially awkward man who just liked to be left alone to obsessively wash his car, have a quiet pint, or nip down to the bookies. Yeah, he probably doesn't have any friends because he seems really boring. One of his new neighbours in Ipswich reckoned that he hardly ever spoke at all, while some of his fellow golfers from Seckford Golf Club suggested that he was probably the most boring bloke in the world. Yeah, he does seem very boring. What are your hobbies? I like washing my car. You what? Something we pay other people to do. Why would you do this? But a couple of other people spotted something else bubbling away beneath the seemingly calm and boring exterior. Elizabeth Roche, a former neighbour from the brief time Wright spent as landlord of the ferryboat inn with his second wife Diane Nicol, told the Telegraph he had an ability to have a violent row 1 minute and then have a calm conversation with you straight afterwards as if nothing had happened. The only way I can describe it is to say that he was a real Jekyll and Hyde character. He definitely had a psycho side to him. Oh my lord. That he's guilty. This is the sort of thing, is like, this guy seems like a psycho, and he does seem like a psycho, and I think he killed all these people, also because there seems to be a shit ton of evidence against him. But didn't Danny say that maybe they didn't get the right guy? Dude, it seems like they got the right dude. Like, what is going to come out that is going to be like, oh no, it wasn't him? This seems pretty locked down, doesn't it? Elizabeth Roche also backs up Diane Nicol's claims that the marriage was violent and abusive, as she recalled 3 times in which Wright attacked his wife in the presence of witnesses and had to be forcibly pulled away by others. According to Elizabeth, on all 3 occasions, he placed his hands around his wife's throat and tried to strangle her. Perhaps we can gain further insight into his true character from the long list of sex workers he regularly paid over the years, but again, the accounts vary quite considerably. Shortly before the 2006 murders had taken place, Wright was widely known in the Ipswich red light district by the nickname of the Mondeo Man, and many of the sex workers claimed that he was viewed as a regular client with whom they felt safe. A few of them even suggested that they'd struck up a kind of friendship with him. But just days after the bodies of the final 2 victims had been found, a sex worker known as Kira revealed that her last encounter with Wright hadn't been quite so friendly. She said, "He pinned me down. He never used to do that. It did scare me when he did it, because it wasn't like him. He was a bit nasty." Wright was believed to have taken a break from sex workers when he first moved into Ipswich with his new partner Pamela, but he was soon heading back out into the red light district when Pamela began working night shifts, which gave him ample opportunity to spend the early hours of the morning cruising the streets in his Ford Mondeo without his partner's knowledge. He was actually stopped by the police on the 1st of December 2006 at around 2 a.m, just 1 day before the first victim was found. They were curious as to why Wright was driving around a red light district at that time in the morning. You can guess! Wright explained that he hadn't been able to sleep, so he'd gone for a quick spin in the car and was completely unaware that he'd accidentally strayed into the red light area. So why were you driving so slow? Why were you looking out your windows and making eye contact with the women? It's like, oh, I was just being polite while on my drive. Come on, dude. Come on now, you got caught. The police probably hear that quite a lot. When questioning a guy in a car in this kind of situation, the guy's unlikely to openly admit that he's on the lookout for paid sex, and then ask the police if they've seen any half-decent sex workers knocking around the area. But even though they suspected he was telling porkies, they had no reason to arrest him, and they sent him on his way. It wouldn't be until 19 days later that the police arrested the now 48-year-old Steve Wright on suspicion of 5 murders. During the police interview, Wright answered no comment to every single question that was put to him. He was charged with all 5 murders and calmly entered a plea of not guilty during the initial 3-hour hearing at the magistrate's court on December 22nd. He would be held in custody for just over a year before the trial finally got underway in very early 2008. Immediately after Wright was charged, the police seemed pretty confident that they'd caught the Suffolk Strangler. A statement was released to the public which revealed that the police were feeling quite buoyant by the latest breakthrough and that they were no longer looking for any fresh leads or information relating to the investigation. This prompted the national media to go into overdrive with reports that the Suffolk Strangler had finally been caught, prompting a call from the then Attorney General Lord Goldsmith to calm down a bit with the sensationalist headlines claims in the interests of a fair trial. Even one of the senior prosecutors in the case took the unusual step of urging restraint from the UK press, declaring, quote, "At this time, I would like to remind you of the need to take care in reporting the events surrounding this case. Stephen Wright stands accused of these offences and has a right to a fair trial before a jury. It is extremely important that there should be responsible media reporting which should not prejudice the due process of law." The press also received additional criticism from other quarters over their choice of language in their coverage of the victims. So many headlines described Steve Wright as a prostitute killer, while accompanying reports focused heavily on the line of work of the victims rather than the individual women. It does seem likely that if all the victims had just happened to work in some kind of retail job, their lifestyles wouldn't have seemed quite so significant in the pages of the press, and the murderer would have been unlikely to be dramatically labelled the retail work killer. But the fact that all these victims were sex workers just seemed to dominate the tone of the contemporary reporting. So, as if to suggest that this serial killer didn't target normal women, he only targeted a batch of largely faceless prostitutes who didn't lead proper lives anyway. Again, this is another illustration of why it was perceived at the time that the murders of sex workers weren't taken as seriously or as sympathetically as they should by the public, the police, and the press, even if they could still potentially generate a darkly gripping headline. So, the trial of Steve Wright kicked off on the 16th of January 2008 at Ipswich Crown Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Gross. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, the court had testimony from witnesses, including the parents and the families of many of the victims, the police forensic experts, and of course Tom Stevens, the original suspect to be questioned, who at this point I'm beginning to feel just pounced on any excuse to get out of the house. Yeah, Tom Stevens, they let you go. Just be like, oh, thank God it wasn't me. Oh, thank God I'm not a werewolf. Great news. Go back to Tesco and get on with your life. The jury of 9 men and 3 women also managed to get out and about a bit as they took regular excursions from the courtroom over the course of the trial, although these field trips weren't the kind of fun events that involved selfies and stops for ice cream. They were instead given a grim guided tour of the various sites at which the bodies of the murder victims had been discovered. But it became apparent very quickly that the prosecutor, Peter Wright QC, who 8 years earlier had helped put notorious serial killer Dr. Harold Shipman behind bars for life, had a bit of a challenge on his hands here. There was clearly no single piece of compelling evidence that proved Steve Wright was guilty of murdering 5 women. Bro, his carpet fibers from his car were on their bodies. There was 2 people's blood on his yellow jacket thing. It seems like there's a lot of forensic evidence connecting these things. There were certainly plenty of coincidences. Oh, come on, the blood, the hair, including the fact that all 5 victims had worked in the same area and had been subject to asphyxiation. And 2 of the victims had been left posed in an identical cruciform position, a detail which was only now being revealed to the public and a shocked courtroom for the very first time. Steve Wright's DNA had been found on 3 of his victims, whilst microscopic fibers connected with Wright had been found on all 5 bodies. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. He could have frequented their services. But the carpet fibers in the hair, the blood, that's not some normal shit. That's weird. Along with specks of blood from 2 of the victims found in his car and on his abandoned fluorescent jacket found near one of the deposition sites. The jury was shown CCTV footage of Tanya Nicol climbing into an unidentified Ford Mondeo on the night she vanished, along with footage of a similar Ford Mondeo popping up very near the deposition sites at around the same time at which the bodies were believed to have been discarded. Peter Wright QC also put forward the surprising theory that more than one person may have been involved in the murders, or at least the movement of the bodies. Some of the victims had been found quite some distance from the nearest road, but there was no evidence of any snag marks to indicate that the bodies had been roughly dragged across the countryside. Of course, it's not out of the question that one individual could still have carried the bodies alone, albeit in a pretty conspicuous manner, but it's also possible that he had help from an accomplice to help speed up the operation and reduce the risk of detection. It was also noted around this time in the proceedings that the original self-proclaimed suspect, Tom Stevens, did not have a single alibi to verify his whereabouts on any of the nights that the women were believed to have been murdered, but it's worth stressing that no evidence was ever found to link Tom Stevens to the murders. But whilst the prosecution case may have lacked that one piece of substantial evidence, Peter Wright QC argued that all the separate pieces of the criminal jigsaw clearly pointed to Steve Wright as the only common denominator in all the murders. Yeah, dude, this is open and shut to me. You may conclude that by now the disappearance of these women and the discovery of their bodies was the work of someone, either alone or with the help of another, who was engaged on a deliberate campaign of murder directed at the working prostitutes of Ipswich. The chances of each of these women having met wholly unrelated deaths was by now, you may conclude, so unlikely as to be capable of being excluded. Steve Wright had seemed noticeably detached and disengaged during the whole trial and showed no flicker of emotion as the families of the victims spoke at length about the lives of their loved ones and the raw grief over their brutal deaths. Yeah, because he's a psycho. We know he's a psycho. He's got psycho vibes. He wasn't particularly chatty when he finally took the stand himself, answering the vast majority of the questions with brief variations of the lines, "It would appear so, yes," or "If you say so, yes." He did reveal that he used to regularly frequent massage parlors and brothels in the past. Shortly after moving to Ipswich with Pamela Wright, he had often sneaked off to this type of establishment after a round of golf. But by the end of 2006, he had figured out that he could save a bit of money on the £80 he used to fork out at massage parlors by cruising the red light district in Ipswich, where he could pick up sex for as little as £20 a time. He was also happy to reveal that he was very familiar with most of the relatively obscure deposition sites, and on a more crucial note, he had a fairly good justification for all the DNA and microfiber evidence that linked him with the victims. Wright told the court that he'd not only had encounters with all 5 victims, but he had paid for full sex with 4 of them. The only exception was Tanya Nicol, although this claim appears to potentially contradict the CCTV footage of Tanya getting into the Ford Mondeo, which looked remarkably similar to the vehicle owned by Wright. He actually conceded that it may well have been his car, but he recalled a night in which he picked up Tanya and then swiftly changed his mind after noticing she had acne, which apparently put him off the whole idea. He claims to have dropped her off again with no hard feelings between the two, and then returned home after having lost the urge to pay for sex that night. But his main defense was based around the fairly reasonable suggestion that the DNA and microfiber evidence were hardly surprising, as all 4 women had been in his car and had paid for sex with at least 4 of them, although, of course, the specks of blood found in the car and on his fluorescent jacket are far more suspicious. Yeah, and also the location of the carpet fibers in the hair. That's suspicious. And the blood is even more suspicious. Wright also claimed that he wasn't doing anything wrong during the occasions when his Ford Mondeo was spotted on CCTV late at night near most of the deposition sites, as he just couldn't sleep and was driving around to relax. He does appear to have a bit of a recurring problem with sleepless nights. Oh, he does he, Danny? No, officer, couldn't sleep. Just driving slow, looking at ladies in this part of town, waving to them, inviting them into my car. I just couldn't sleep. I was just on a drive. He's all innocent, officer. In short, Steve Wright's defense team, led by Timothy Langdale QC, argued that none of the evidence conclusively proved that their client was guilty of murder. He had simply been himself a victim of a string of singularly unfortunate coincidences. Explain the blood! You can't, can you? Because you're guilty. At the close of the trial, Mr. Justice Gross urged the jury to cast aside their emotions and potential prejudices when considering the verdict. He told them, "The loss of these 5 young lives is clearly a tragedy. You may view with some distaste the lifestyles of those involved. Whatever drugs they took, whatever the work they did, no one is entitled to do these women any harm, let alone kill them." But the jury seemed to take everyone by surprise, including the press and the prosecution team, when they reached a unanimous verdict in a relatively rapid window of time. As they chewed over their decision, on Thursday the 21st of February 2008, the general assumption was that the deliberations would rumble on well into the following week. Quite a few of the assembled members of the press and media had even packed up and gone back to the office, as they figured that nothing noteworthy was likely to happen over the next few days. But after just 8 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom to deliver the verdict. They found Steve Wright to be guilty of all 5 counts of murder. As the verdict was announced, Wright again showed no trace of emotion, because he's a psycho. During the sentencing, held on February the 22nd, it was already clear beforehand that Wright would be serving term of life imprisonment for multiple murders, but a question remained over how long he'd have to wait before potentially becoming eligible for parole. Mr. Justice Gross wasted no time in making his feelings known on this matter when he addressed Steve Wright. Drugs and prostitution meant the victims were at risk, but neither drugs nor prostitution killed them. You did. This was a targeted campaign of murder. You killed them, stripped them, and left them. Why you did it may never be known. It is right you should spend your whole life in prison. As it was declared that Wright must never be released from prison, his brother and sister openly wept in the courtroom, but Wright himself remained impassive and stared blankly ahead as if he hadn't heard the ruling. He made no eye contact with anybody at all as he was led away to begin the first day of his whole life sentence. The families of the victims shared contrasting opinions on the verdict in the immediate aftermath of the trial. The father of Gemma Adams felt that justice had most definitely been served. He said, quote, "I am very relieved and pleased for all the families that this is now over and we can now start to get on with our lives. I can't speak highly enough about the police in this case. I don't have any feelings about Wright." However, the families of both Tanya Nicol and Paula Clennell felt that only the return of the death penalty could deliver a serving of genuine justice in this case. Well, yes, but we don't have the death penalty in the UK, so What were you hoping for? They're going to bring it back for you, but they're not going to bring it back for Shipman? Like, come on now. A statement prepared by the family of Tanya Nicol was read out to the press. Today, as this case has come to an end, we would like to say justice has been done, but we're afraid that where 5 young lives have been cruelly ended, the person responsible will be kept warm, nourished, and protected. In no way has justice been done. These crimes deserve the ultimate punishment, and that can only mean one thing. Where a daughter and the other victims were given no human rights by this monster, he will be guarded by the establishment at great cost to the taxpayers of this country. Well, yes, look, he's not going to have a great time in prison, though. He's not warm and protected and this sort of stuff. You want to spend the rest of your life in prison? No, it's probably going to be pretty miserable. Steve Wright has always protested his innocence. An initial appeal against the convictions was rejected in early 2008, while a second appeal was quietly dropped in early 2009. In a letter to the East Anglia Daily Times published in August 2008, Steve Wright described how he felt numb with shock upon hearing the verdict in the courtroom, as if a knife had been thrust into his heart. He also declared in the same letter, quote, "People should believe that I am innocent, because I have gone through my whole life trying to be as fair and considerate to other people as I possibly could. I don't have a violent bone in my body, and to take a life I would have thought would be the ultimate form of aggression. All the evidence proved was that I had contact with the girls, but not one shred of evidence showed that I killed them. Didn't you have, a violent history? Didn't one of your... no one really ever expanded on the end of the marriages or anything like that, right? I'm not so sure that there wasn't one shred of evidence. There were several shreds of evidence, which arguably piled up into a pretty hefty pile of shreds of evidence. Yeah, agreed. I definitely think this guy is guilty. But Steve Wright still has plenty of supporters who feel that the trial was unfair and that Wright is an innocent man who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or to be more accurate, he was frequently in exactly the wrong places at exactly the wrong times. Yeah, it's a hell of a coincidence, isn't it? A lot of people bang on about the fact that there were differences in how the bodies were discarded and posed. The first 2 were thrown into a brook, while the other 3 were found in spots of the countryside, and only 2 of the latter ones were posed in a cruciform position. And all this could indicate that completely different killers were at work in the same small area. But as we've already covered, there could be a number of reasons as to why a murderer might mix up his methods over time. It seems a bit of a stretch to suggest that the final 2 victims from the same area who also went missing at roughly the same time and whose asphyxiated bodies were found within a few hundred yards of each other on the same night must surely have been murdered by 2 different killers just because only one of them had been left in a crucifix shape. Yes, please, come on. It's quite ridiculous. Crime writer and investigator David Dixon raises more pressing points about the credibility of the scraps of evidence. Okay, I'm willing to hear your argument, David. Investigator and crime writer, let's see. He feels that the vast majority of the microfiber deposits would have been quickly lost due to the elements within just a few hours of the naked bodies being abandoned, and he finds it hard to believe that such supposedly incriminating deposits were found on no less than 3 of the victims. So what are you saying? It's like a frame-up? There's also something a little stranger about the specks of blood found on Wright's clothing and in his car. We've already established that there were likely to be DNA and microfiber connections with Steve Wright and all 5 victims, as all 5 of the women had been in the car, and he had admitted to having full sex with at least 4 of them. The specks of blood may suggest that something more sinister was going on than consensual sex between 2 adults. Having said that, it's not entirely out of the question that tiny specks of blood may have been produced from consensual sex or very faint menstruation stains. Well, can't they test the blood to see what type of blood it is? The point that I find most puzzling about the specks of blood is that whilst all 5 victims showed signs of asphyxiation, there were no other signs of physical assault or wounds on any of the bodies, so it's not entirely clear where these specks of blood were supposed to have come from or how they relate in any way to Steve Wright's guilt. Then there's the small matter of a blue BMW. Various witnesses have claimed that Tanya Nicol, Gemma Adams, Annette Nicholls, and Paula Clennell were all seen climbing into either a blue BMW or a posh blue car shortly before they disappeared, whilst the doorman of a local club observed a blue BMW being driven in an erratic and suspicious manner in the early hours of a December morning around the same time that the first bodies were discovered. Yet this line of inquiry appears to have been completely dropped when the police effectively stopped looking for other suspects after arresting Steve Wright. I'm not necessarily trying to suggest that Steve Wright is an innocent man, no, but this stuff should have definitely been brought up by the defense because it's a hell of a way to get reasonable doubt. But it could be argued that his guilt was not proven quite as conclusively as one might have expected. However, he remains in prison to this day, and the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, still seem convinced that the conviction was based on science and they got the right man. A man with a reported history of abusing and attempting to strangle his ex-partner, who was the only proven link between all 5 women and most of the deposition sites. Something we may never know is exactly what motivated Steve Wright to carry out these 5 murders. His father, Conrad, later told the BBC that it was all the fault of Steve Wright's mother. He felt that a young Steve Wright was left damaged by his mother's departure and never fully got over what he perceived to be a betrayal and abandonment. Conrad feels that this is what turned Wright against women in general. I mean, fine, you can say that, but he still killed people. Like, it doesn't matter what happened to him in his childhood. This is a I'm sure it's a terrible thing to happen, but it's very minor compared to some of the monsters that we've seen made on this channel. He also claims that his relationship with his son is now non-existent, and he feels some level of guilt for bringing a murderer into the world. But Conrad did reveal the contents of a letter he received while Wright was still awaiting trial, in which his son described himself as a placid person, but admits, "Whenever I get upset, I tend to bury it deep inside," which I suppose is not a healthy thing to do, because the more I do that, the more withdrawn I become, because I have seen too much anger and violence in my childhood to last a lifetime. Incidentally, when Steve Wright's mother, Patricia, waved goodbye to her 6-year-old son at the train station in 1964, it wouldn't be the last time that they ever saw each other. They enjoyed a brief reunion of sorts in 1992 when Patricia flew over from California to spend Christmas with her family. But although things initially appeared to be going well, Patricia told the press that shortly before she was due to fly back to California, her son became aggressive with her and flew into a drunken, expletive-ridden rage. The pair would never speak again. However, others have suggested that trying to pin all the blame on his mother's departure is clearly a lame excuse and a distasteful attempt to somehow justify the actions of a vile individual. Yeah, I mean, it's just a silly thing. It's obviously that didn't make him a murderer, and even if it did, it's not her fault. It's a shitty thing to do. Yes, did it make him a murderer? Maybe, but he's a murderer. It's not the reason. It's not enough. It's not an excuse. Psychologist Emma Kenny is particularly disturbed by how he took the time to pose some of the bodies in the cruciform position, and has considered that while this may have been partly down to trying to throw the police off the scent and suggest that multiple killers were at work, it may also have simply been because he got a perverse kick out of doing it. Colleen Moore, a criminologist at Anglia Ruskin University, is a little more blunt in her assessment, quoting her, "Lots of people have their parents walk out on them while they are young, and of course it's distressing. That's a natural response. But most people don't deal with their feeling of abandonment by murdering. Steve Wright was not a fool. He was a cruel man who hated women and did what he did because he wanted to." Yes, well said, Colleen. Whilst not everyone may be entirely convinced of Steve Wright's guilt, there are others who believe that he may have been responsible for many more historical unsolved murders and disappearances dating back to the 1980s. The reasoning here is that Wright was 48 years old at the time of the Ipswich murders, and that's generally considered to be a bit of a late start for a serial killer. They've usually committed their first murder well before they've hit 35. Criminologist David Wilson feels it's highly unlikely that a man with a reported history of violence towards women would leave it so late in life before conducting a string of murders, which were conducted with enough cold and calculating precision to suggest that the killer may have had some previous experience. It's a theory which has been given some weight by the claims of a sex worker called Linda St. Clair, known to her clients as Miss Whiplash, who informed the press in 2008 that she was very nearly a victim of Steve Wright in the 1980s. Linda, from Hertfordshire, let's not call her Miss Whiplash, revealed that she recognized a photograph of Steve Wright in the newspapers shortly after he had been charged with murder, and recalled that it was the very same client who had paid her for sex over 20 years earlier in London. After business had been conducted, Linda claims that Wright angrily lunged at her with his arms outstretched as if to strangle her, but she managed to flee into the streets. She also claimed that she had reported the incident to the police, but the Metropolitan Police later declared that no formal complaint had ever been made. However, before we start pointing the finger at Steve Wright for every unsolved murder or disappearance in the region since about 1982, it's worth pointing out that he can already be ruled out from some of them, including one disappearance in particular, to which he was strongly connected for many years, and perhaps with good reason. 25-year-old Susie Lampler was an estate agent who went missing in July 1986 and was never found. She was declared legally dead in 1994. On the day that she went missing, she was supposed to be meeting up with a mysterious client known only as Mr. Kipper for a house viewing in Fulham, but she was never seen again. So could this Mr. Kipper have actually been Steve Wright? Okay, waiting for the connection because this just seems to be like a murder. Well, here's why it's a little suspicious. Steve Wright and Susie Lampler had worked together on the QE2 in the early 1980s when Wright was working as a steward and Susie had a job as a beautician. In fact, it appears that they might have even become quite good friends. Wright's father, Conrad, admitted in 2017 that he had grave concerns over whether his son might have been involved in Susie's disappearance after rifling through an old photograph album and finding a picture of Wright and Susie Lampler together. Not only, that's it. That's the only connection. Someone he once knew was killed. Not only that, but around the time of Susie's disappearance, Wright was still working in his final full year on the QE2, but it was alleged by a former partner that he just happened to be on shore leave at that time, and nobody really knew exactly where he'd gone. Sounds dodgy, right? So what was he actually up to? Well, let's not jump to conclusions. I don't feel I'm jumping to any conclusions. I feel like this is a stretch. The police later checked the QE2 records and confirmed that Wright was very much on board the QE2 during the time of Susie's disappearance. The police have also since named serial rapist and murderer John Cannon as the prime suspect in the case, although the Crown Prosecution Service has concluded that there's not enough evidence to charge Cannon, who is already serving a whole life sentence. Steve Wright has also been connected with and consequently ruled out of a long list of other unsolved murders. Natalie Pearman was a sex worker who lived in Norwich during the same period that Wright lived in the city. In fact, she was last seen alive looking for business outside the very same ferryboat inn where Wright had served as the landlord a few years previously. She was found naked and strangled to death in a lay-by in 1992, which later drew obvious comparisons to how Wright's victims had been discovered in 2006. However, although the killer had never been found, the police came to have a full DNA profile of the killer, which rules out Wright from the list of suspects. Yeah, I mean, you can't just be like, I was there at that point, someone was murdered, it was him. I guess it's worth ruling out, but it's not him. You've got to have evidence. It's a very similar tragic story with 22-year-old Michelle Bettles, another sex worker from Norwich, who was strangled to death and discarded in a stretch of woodland in March 2002. The son of a retired police officer was arrested for murder in April 2003 following a DNA match, but he was released after admitting that he'd paid for sex with Michelle Bettles, apparently the only time in his life he'd ever done such a thing, if we're to believe that, but he was not responsible for her death. Yeah, it's like, no, it wasn't. It's one time. Only once. Only ever. Michelle's father believed for a long time that his daughter could well have been an earlier victim of Steve Wright, as the case bore so many similarities to the 2006 Ipswich murders. But again, whilst the killer has never been found, Steve Wright has been ruled out following extensive DNA profiling. There are other cases, though, in which Steve Wright is still very much viewed as the prime suspect by many, or it might be fairer to say that he hasn't been comprehensively ruled out yet. Well, it's kind of like really looking at guilty until proven innocent here, aren't we? That's not the way it works. 32-year-old mother of two, Jeanette Kempton, was found dead in a ditch in the village of Wangford in Suffolk in 1989, just under 120 miles away from her home in Brixton, South London. Former Norfolk Police Intelligence Officer Chris Clark believes that there may have been a link here with Steve Wright. The cause of death was strangulation, and Wright was living in South London at the time, but still very familiar with the remote areas of Suffolk in which the body was ultimately discarded. 5 other suspects were questioned, including the ex-husband of Jeanette, but nobody has ever been charged with her murder. Further unsolved investigations include the disappearance of 26-year-old Ipswich sex worker Amanda Duncan, who went missing in July 1993, and Norwich sex worker Kelly Pratt, who was last seen alive in June 2000. There's one final case that we need to cover in detail, and that's the murder of 17-year-old student Victoria Hall. I wouldn't usually find it appropriate to kick off a description of a murdered teenager by emphasizing straight away that she definitely wasn't a sex worker, but I think it's understandable that we should make this clear from the start, as there's a clear distinction between Victoria and the known victims of Steve Wright. Victoria hailed from the village of Trimley St Mary in Suffolk and was last seen alive on September 18, 1999. She'd been enjoying a night out at the town at the Bandbox nightclub in Felixstowe with her friend Gemma. After leaving the club at 1 a.m, they realised they didn't have enough money left over for a taxi home, so they decided to instead spend their last bit of cash on a couple of bags of chips from the Bodrum Grill before taking the 2-mile walk back home to Trimley St Mary. Yeah, definitely been there. It's like, no, I don't have any money, I gotta walk all the way home. I should have had that last drink, I should have saved it for a taxi. They parted company at 2:20 a.m, by which time Victoria was literally just a few yards away from her home, but she never made it to the door. Her friend Gemma later recalled that she heard screams in the distance as she walked away, but assumed it was just kids messing about. Other neighborhood residents also reported screams or shouting in the early hours of the morning, along with the sound of a car with a noisy exhaust driving off at some speed. After her parents reported Victoria missing the following morning, there would be a wait of 5 days before an inevitable dark discovery was made by a dog walker in the village of Creeting St Peter, about 25 miles away from Trimley St Mary. The naked body of Victoria Hall had been left in a ditch. Post-mortem wasn't able to determine the exact cause of death, but noted that Victoria had suffered some degree of asphyxiation. I mean, so far that's the only thing that links these two. How is Wright getting linked to this? The following year, a local businessman was arrested twice on suspicion of her murder, but after spending 10 months in custody followed by a 2-week trial, he was eventually found not guilty in late 2001. It's not entirely surprising that ever since then, the name of Steve Wright has been frequently linked to a case that remains unsolved to this day. Just like Wright's 5 known victims, Victoria's asphyxiated naked body had shown no signs of assault before it was discarded in a remote spot in Suffolk during a period when Wright lived himself just a half-mile away from the victim. The police also had managed to obtain a partial registration of the vehicle, which may have been spotted revving off at high speed during the early hours of the morning when Victoria was last seen alive. There are several matches to vehicle registrations in the local area, including the car owned by Steve Steve Wright, but he was never brought in for questioning at the time. Yeah, I mean, how many vehicles match the partial, though? The parents of Victoria Hall don't believe that the killer will ever be caught unless he comes forward and confesses. But her father, Graham, is of the opinion that it most likely wasn't Steve Wright. He told the press, "With due respect to the girls Wright killed, not all the circumstances were the same. They were working girls, and that appears to be who he was aiming for." Now, this is a bit of a sensitive area for discussion, as it's perhaps perfectly understandable why Victoria's parents don't want the death of their 17-year-old daughter to be any way associated with a murderer known only to target sex workers, and it's possible that this element is swaying their opinion on the matter. What sways my opinion on the matter is there's not really anything linking him other than he was nearby and maybe it was a partial of his license plate. But maybe. Or maybe they're making a perfectly fair point and others are just being a little too hasty in frequently accusing Steve Wright of everything. I mean, even a convicted criminal should always be presumed innocent of committing any other crimes until they're found guilty of such charges in a court of law. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. We're really verging into guilty until proven innocent here. It'd be wrong to assume that Steve Wright must surely be responsible for every single murder or disappearance that had occurred in Suffolk or Norfolk between 1987 and 2006. So let's give the guy a break and stop hassling him over every case that the police haven't yet got around to solving. Oh, hang on a bit though, because we've got a tiny morsel of breaking news. Okay then. In July 2021, an inmate of HM Prison Long Lartin was arrested by Suffolk police in connection with the murder of Victoria Hall. And just as I was nearing the end of the first draft of this script, it was announced that the same man had been arrested again on December 7th, 2023, and taken into police custody for questioning over the murder. This is incredibly recent. Incidentally, this is the second time in a row that this has happened to me whilst writing a casual criminalist script. If any senior investigating officers out there are keen to make a fresh progress on a case that went cold years ago, just get me to write a casual criminalist script about it on the topic, and you're guaranteed to see fresh developments just when I foolishly think I've reached a final full stop. Sorry, Danny. Well, it has to be said that there's not an awful lot to report here, as the police are remaining tight-lipped on the matter for now, and haven't even officially named the arrested man, but various media sources, including the BBC and Sky News, have been happy to name him as Steve Wright, who just happens to be serving his life sentence at the very same HM Prison Long Lartin. If it is him, which we don't even know it is, then some more evidence has emerged. I'm not saying we should have discounted him as a suspect, I'm just saying you need more evidence before you presume guilt. Nearly 25 years after Victoria Hall was murdered, the investigation still seems to be very much ongoing, and the story of Steve Wright may or may not yield further chapters. I'm just relieved that the police didn't bother to question original Suffolk murder suspect Tom Stevens over any of these unsolved murders or disappearances, as he'd most likely just confessed to anything and everything that was put to him whilst howling at the moon. Yeah, poor Tom, just a misguided dude who just needs to go back to Tesco. There has certainly been a whole raft of positive change in attitudes and policing, and to a certain extent government policy since the dark ages of 2006. On a local level, the Ipswich Borough Council and the police sought to push the red light district out of town for good, and fortunately they took a slightly more sensible approach than just going in there with batons blazing and arresting every sex worker they encountered. Now, this is simplifying things a bit, but the preferred approach was generally to go in there with all batons blazing and either arrest or scare away every suspicious bloke they encountered so that no business could possibly be conducted on the streets. Meanwhile, many of the sex workers were offered support and help to get them off the streets instead of the usual threat of a trip in a police car. Now, this obviously didn't eradicate the problem overnight, and some sex workers have since returned to the streets of Ipswich in more recent years, but in nowhere near the same numbers as about 20 years ago. It's been suggested that one of the biggest outcomes of all of this has been the push for sex workers to go into safer and more controlled environments behind closed doors, and the local police are reported to turn a blind eye to this unless there are any signs of trouble which may be putting the women in danger. That's how it works though, right? It's not illegal if it's like off the streets and not pimping and stuff like that, right? Don't quote me on that. I might be entirely wrong. The UK government has also changed its approach to tackling prostitution to some degree, although it could be accused of dragging its heels and perhaps not being brave enough to go the full distance. It's always been a tricky legal area, as the act of engaging in sexual activities in return for money has never actually been illegal in the UK, although many of the activities associated with this are against the law, such as touting or looking for business in a public place or running a brothel. The government has slowly followed the example set by Ipswich by targeting the clients rather than treating the actual sex workers like criminals. In April 2010, it became a criminal offence to have sex with someone who's been forced or threatened into providing those services by a third party. Only in 2010? What the f***? Perhaps the only puzzle here is why it took until 2010 for this to become a criminal offence, but the interesting point here is that this is a strict liability offence. So in other words, even if the client was completely oblivious that the sex worker had been exploited into providing services against their will, the clients will still be found guilty of the offence. So this is kind of like a speeding ticket. It's like, because normally when you commit a crime, you need two things. You need the actus regus and the mens rea. God, it's been a long time since I studied this. And the mens rea is like the intention to do it. The act and the intention. And if you don't have intention, you're usually not guilty. But so speeding tickets, you might have just not be paying attention. So you don't technically have the intention of speeding. And so you wouldn't normally be guilty. But a strict liability means that even if you do it without knowing, you're still guilty. This is a pretty heavy thing to make strict liability, to be honest. Meanwhile, the Association of Chief Police Officers issued revised guidance in 2011, which was a direct response to the Ipswich murders, declaring that sex workers should be treated as vulnerable women in need of help and rehabilitation rather than criminals. It's obviously encouraging to see that the British police are now far more interested in the safety and exploitation of sex workers, but some might argue that by simply arresting all the clients instead, we haven't quite come far enough. A couple of years before the Ipswich murders in 2004, then Home Secretary David Blunkett had proposed some pretty radical plans to introduce fully licensed brothels and red light zones in the UK in a bid to completely decriminalise every element of the transaction and offer greater protection for sex workers. This has been done in other countries and it's been shown to work well. So I feel like that seems like a pretty good move, David Blunkett. The move was blocked by the government, reportedly over fears that tatty old rags like the Daily Mail would launch a hostile attack on the clearly perverted government's new policy of glamorizing and encouraging prostitution. Yeah, that's what they're doing, Daily Mail. It's exactly the sort of shit the Daily Mail would pull. In the meantime, the best result we have now is that most police forces in the UK again followed the example of Ipswich by turning a blind eye to brothels. Massage parlours. This doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, which seemed to take a surprising step backward in 2015 when it introduced a new act which criminalised the purchase of sex. But perhaps we have to look further than invisible brothels to get to the real root of the problem, which has in some ways led to the deaths or disappearances of so many street workers. In the case of the Ipswich murders, the direct reason that Gemma Adams, Tanya Nicol, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nicholls are no longer with us is obviously because a twisted individual murdered them. But there was a common factor in how exactly all 5 women found themselves on a path which put them in such immediate danger, and that common factor was drug addiction. I'm sure many sex workers are actually quite happy in their job, particularly the ones that work in the relatively safer environment of a massage parlour. In fact, a recent survey conducted by Leeds University suggests that a majority of British sex workers enjoy the fun and flexibility of the job. But figures released by the UK government paint a different story on the streets, where it's estimated that somewhere between 80 to 95% of sex workers are funding a hard drug habit. I think it's fair to assume that all 5 victims weren't out on the streets of Ipswich through career choice, but rather as a desperate last resort, particularly the final 2 victims who were already aware of the alarming disappearances of sex workers in the local area, yet still felt compelled to return to the exact same red light district where the victims were known to tout for business. Some have suggested that if Home Secretary David Blunkett had got his way with fully licensed brothels, the killer would have never had the opportunity to murder his victims, but I'm not entirely convinced by this. You need to fully adhere to the rules and codes of conduct to keep your job in a licensed brothel, and we already know that at least one of the victims, possibly more, was booted out of a massage parlour over problems with drug use and forced onto the streets. It's not all down to licensing and legality, it's largely down to the drug addiction, which closes off safer avenues of work. Again, Ipswich appear to have led the way in tackling this problem too. Family members of all 5 victims who helped set up charity called Somebody's Daughter, which works with women battling or recovering from drug addiction, whilst Ipswich Borough Council and the police have reportedly helped a large number of sex workers to get off the street for good by offering them strong support and rehab programs. On a national level, sex workers found guilty of repeatedly looking for work on the streets are now far less likely to get slapped with a hefty fine that would only serve to increase their need to raise fast money by any means necessary, and far more likely to receive an engagement and support order designed to help deal with any potential drug habits. We seem to be making some progress here, but perhaps not as quickly as we should. Whilst we may never fully understand what drives a killer to take the lives of so many innocent women, we can at least try to understand and tackle the root problems that drove the victims straight into his web. And that's where we end today's episode. Thanks for being here.